The cat kept mewing non-stop on top of the coffin. What happened next was incredible. Deborah Wilson never imagined that her husband Richard's wake would turn into the most disturbing and revealing episode of her entire life. What should have been a respectful farewell quickly became a spectacle that left the entire Wilson family questioning everything they thought they knew about their patriarch. Whiskers, the tabby cat Richard had found on the street 3 years earlier, simply wouldn't stop meowing on top of the coffin. These weren't the normal meows of a confused animal missing its owner. They were desperate cries, as if the feline was trying to communicate something urgent to everyone present in the funeral home. "Get that animal out of here," exclaimed Emily, Deborah's youngest daughter, her voice choked. "This is so disrespectful to Dad." But when Michael, the eldest son, tried to grab Whiskers, the cat became even more agitated. Its claws dug into the polished wood of the coffin, and its meows grew louder, echoing through the silent chapel like an alarm no one could turn off. "Leave the little thing be," whispered Mr. Thompson, the family's longtime neighbor. "Maybe it senses something we can't." Deborah watched the scene with a heavy heart. In the last few weeks, ever since Richard had been hospitalized for heart problems, Whiskers had been acting strangely. The cat, usually affectionate and calm, had become restless, pacing the house all night and refusing to eat. The doctor had explained that Richard had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest in his sleep at the hospital. A peaceful passing, he'd said. But now, seeing Whiskers' desperation, Deborah began to wonder if there was more to the story. "Mom, are you okay?" Michael asked, stepping closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know, son. Whiskers' behavior is really worrying me," she replied, wiping away a stubborn tear. The wake was being held at Riverside Funeral Home in downtown Riverdale, a small town in Wisconsin, where the Wilson family had lived for 3 generations. The room was filled with flowers, wreaths, and people offering condolences, but everyone seemed more interested in the spectacle the cat was creating than in honoring Richard's memory. Mrs. Jenkins, the woman who lived next door, approached Deborah with a concerned expression. "Deborah, dear, I need to tell you something." Over. The last few weeks, I heard Richard talking to himself in the backyard several times late at night. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to intrude. Deborah felt a chill in her stomach. Richard had never been the type to talk to himself. He was a practical, straightforward man who always kept his thoughts to himself. What was he saying? "Mrs. Jenkins." I couldn't make it out clearly, but he sounded like he was explaining something to someone, and Whiskers was always with him when it happened. As the two spoke, Whiskers continued its desperate meowing. The cat had positioned itself right over Richard's chest, as if trying to perform some kind of feline CPR. "This is so weird," Emily murmured to Michael. "I've never seen a cat act like this." "Maybe it's just missing Dad," Michael replied, but his voice betrayed an uncertainty he was trying to hide. Father Patrick, who was to lead the religious service, arrived at the funeral home around 2 in the afternoon. When he saw the cat on the coffin, he stopped mid-step with a puzzled expression. "In 40 years as a priest, I've never seen anything like this," he said to Deborah. "Animals have a sensitivity we humans have lost. Perhaps Whiskers says sensing something our eyes can't see." Deborah clung to the priest's words like a lifeline in an ocean of doubt. Since morning, a strange feeling had settled in her chest. It wasn't just the pain of loss, but something deeper, as if an important part of the story hadn't been told yet. "Father, do you think there's any chance Richard might still be—" Deborah couldn't finish the sentence. "My child, medical procedures are very precise these days, but the bond between animals and their owners goes beyond our understanding. Whiskers might simply be expressing his grief in a way we don't understand." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Robert Anderson, the family doctor for over 20 years, arrived. Deborah had called him when Whiskers' behavior grew even more intense, with the cat scratching the coffin and making sounds that resembled human cries more than feline meows. "Dr. Robert, could you take a look at Whiskers?" "He's been acting very strangely ever since Richard, since everything happened. The doctor approached the coffin carefully. Whiskers watched him with bright green eyes but didn't stop meowing. Dr. Robert placed his stethoscope on the animal's chest to check his heartbeat. His heart is racing, but that's normal given the stress of the situation. Deborah, I know it might seem odd, but some animals develop a kind of denial when they lose their owners. They may spend days or even weeks trying to wake the person. But doctor, this started before Richard passed. Whiskers had been restless for weeks. Dr. Robert stroked his graying beard, thoughtful. That's interesting. Cats have a keen sense of smell and can detect chemical changes in the human body. It's possible Whiskers sensed something was wrong with Richard's health before we doctors even noticed. Deborah felt her legs weaken. If Whiskers had noticed something, why hadn't anyone paid attention? Why hadn't she, as his wife, seen the signs the animal was trying to communicate? Doctor, is there any chance you might be wrong about Richard's condition? The doctor sighed deeply. It was a question he'd heard many times in his career, always from family members who hadn't yet accepted the reality of loss. Deborah, I understand your pain and your doubts, but I personally verified his vitals at the hospital. Richard had no heartbeat, no breathing, no neurological reflexes. Unfortunately, there's no question about his condition. Yet even with the medical explanation, Deborah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Whiskers' behavior was just one piece of a puzzle she still couldn't fully put together. For the rest of the afternoon, more people arrived to offer condolences. Richard's co-workers, neighbors, church friends, distant relatives. Everyone commented on the cat's strange behavior, creating a murmur Deborah found disrespectful, but which also fed her own doubts. Then Stephen arrived, Richard's younger brother, who lived in Chicago and only came to Riverdale on special occasions. Stephen and Richard had fallen out years ago over a family inheritance and had only kept sporadic contact since. Deborah, I'm so sorry, Stephen said, hugging his sister-in-law with a tenderness she hadn't expected. I know Richard and I had our differences, but he was always a good man. Thank you for coming, Stephen. I know you didn't talk much, but I'm sure Richard would be happy to know you're here. Stephen approached the casket and was immediately intrigued by Whiskers' behavior. The cat, who had quieted down a bit during the conversation with Dr. Robert became agitated again as Stephen got closer. How strange, Stephen murmured. Richard told me about this cat in the last letters we exchanged. He said the animal was very calm and affectionate. Letters? Deborah was surprised. You were corresponding. Stephen seemed embarrassed for having brought it up. Well, yes. Over the last few months, Richard wrote me a few letters. Nothing too important, just trying to mend our friendship after so many years of silence. Deborah felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Richard had never mentioned he was writing to his brother. In their 42 years of marriage, he had always been very open about his relationships and activities. Why would he hide something as simple as exchanging letters with Stephen? Did he mention anything about being sick or worried about his health? Actually, he did. In the last letter, which I got about 2 weeks ago, he said he was feeling more tired than usual and had some important matters to settle. He told me he wanted to talk to me in person soon. Deborah looked at the casket, where Whiskers continued his meowing. With each new piece of information, more questions arose in her mind. Why hadn't Richard told her about the letters? What important matters did he want to settle? And why did Whiskers seem so desperate to communicate something? Stephen, did you bring those letters? I'd really like to read them. Of course, Deborah, they're in my car. I'll go get them for you. As Stephen left to retrieve the letters, Emily approached her mother with a worried expression. Mom, are you okay? You seem really upset. Honey, I'm starting to realize your father was keeping some things from us. He was writing to Uncle Stephen and never mentioned it. Maybe he wanted it to be a surprise to reconcile the family before telling us, suggested Emily, always trying to see the bright side. Maybe, but Deborah looked at Whiskers again. I have a feeling there's much more we don't know. Michael joined the conversation between his mother and sister. What are you talking about? Dad was exchanging letters with Uncle Stephen and never told us, Emily explained. That is strange. Dad was always so open about everything. Remember how he'd tell us every detail about work, the neighbors, his chats at the bakery? Deborah nodded. Richard truly had been a very communicative person. During dinner, he always shared the events of the day, the conversations he'd had, the problems he faced at work. It was almost impossible for him to keep a secret, especially something as simple as writing letters to his brother. Stephen returned with a yellowed envelope in his hands. "Here are the letters, Deborah. There are 4 in total, written over the last 3 months." Deborah took the envelope with trembling hands. She felt as if she were about to uncover something that would change her perspective on the man she'd been married to for over 4 decades. She opened the first letter, dated 3 months ago. "Dear brother Stephen, I know we've spent many years not speaking because of that silly fight over Dad's inheritance, but life is teaching me that time is too precious to waste on pride and resentment. I'm writing because I feel I need to fix things between us. Deborah doesn't know. I'm sending this letter. I want to be sure you're willing to talk first, before telling her and the kids about our reconciliation. How are you? How is the family? I miss the days when we were all so close. Your brother, Richard." Deborah felt tears streaming down her face. The letter revealed a sensitive side of Richard that she knew well, but it also showed he had planned a family reconciliation without telling anyone. Why did he feel the need to keep something so beautiful a secret? She opened the second letter. "Stephen, I was so happy to get your reply. Knowing you also missed our friendship moved me deeply. You asked about my health. I'm fine, but I admit I've been more tired than usual. Deborah hasn't noticed yet, but I've been having some chest pains and shortness of breath when climbing stairs. I don't want to worry her unnecessarily, but maybe I should see a doctor. I've been thinking a lot about our family, about the mistakes I've made, about the things I wish I'd done differently. There's something important I need to settle before anything else, something I've put off for years out of sheer pride. I hope we can talk in person soon. Richard." Deborah stopped reading and looked at Dr. Robert, who was still in the room. "Doctor, Richard mentioned chest pains and shortness of breath 2 months ago. Why didn't he tell me anything?" Deborah, "Many men from Richard's generation struggle with showing vulnerability, especially when it comes to health. They'd rather not worry their families until they're sure there's a real problem. But if he had told me, we could have gotten medical help sooner." "That's true, but there's no use blaming yourself now. Let's keep reading the letters to understand what was going on with him." Deborah opened the third letter. "Stephen, thank you for your concern about my health. I finally went to the doctor, and he said I need some heart tests. I'm a little nervous but trying to stay calm. Deborah has finally noticed something's wrong with me. She keeps insisting I see a specialist. I think I'll tell her about our plans to reconcile. She always liked you and will be happy to know. We're talking again about that important matter I mentioned. I still haven't found the courage to resolve it. It's something that happened many years ago and could change a lot for our family. I'm afraid of how everyone will react, especially Deborah and the kids. If something happens to me, would you help me tell them the truth? Richard." The mood in the funeral home shifted completely. Everyone close to the family stopped talking and gathered around Deborah, who was now reading the letters aloud without realizing it. "What truth is he talking about?" Michael asked, his voice tense. "I don't know, son. Let's see what the last letter says." Deborah opened the fourth and final envelope with trembling hands. "My dear brother, the tests confirmed. I have a serious heart condition. The doctor said I need surgery, but there's no guarantee it'll work. I'm terrified, Stephen. I told Deborah about our correspondence, and she was moved. She said she always knew our fight was just male pride and had been waiting for one. Gave us to take the first step toward reconciliation. But I still haven't told her what really happened that night in 1987. You know what I'm talking about. The secret we've carried all these years. Deborah and the kids deserve the truth, but I'm afraid it might tear our family apart. If I don't survive this surgery, promise me you'll tell them." Everything is explained in the envelope I hid in the attic, behind the box of old photos. Forgive me for bearing this burden alone for so long. Your brother Richard. A deathly silence filled the room. Deborah was pale. Michael and Emily exchanged shocked glances, and Stephen looked deeply ashamed. "Uncle Stephen," said Michael, with a firm voice, What truth was our father trying to tell us? Stephen sighed deeply and looked at the casket where Whiskers continued to meow. It's a very long and complicated story. Maybe this isn't the best time to— It is the best time, Emily interrupted. If Dad wanted us to know, then we have the right to know. Deborah stood up from her chair with determination. Stephen, I need to go home to get that envelope. Will you come with me? Deborah, I don't want to hear excuses. My husband spent the last months of his life tormented by a secret the two of you kept. I need to know what it was. Whiskers, as if understanding the conversation, intensified his meows and began scratching the casket more forcefully. It was as if the animal was desperate for someone to finally pay attention to what he'd been trying to communicate since the wake began. All right, Stephen said, his voice heavy. Let's go to your house. But Deborah, brace yourself. What you're about to discover might change everything you thought about Richard, and about me. Deborah took one last look at Whiskers, who seemed more agitated than ever. It was as if the cat knew someone had finally understood he was trying to reveal an important secret. Emily, Michael, stay here with Father Patrick and watch over the wake. I'll be back in an hour. Mum, we're coming with you, Michael said. No, son. I need to find this out alone first. Then I'll tell you everything. Deborah and Stephen left the funeral home under the worried gazes of everyone present. Whiskers kept up his desperate meows, as if knowing his mission was only just beginning. The Wilson family home was just 10 minutes from the funeral home, in the quiet Oakwood neighborhood, a residential area where most houses had been home to middle-class families for decades. The house was a simple two-story with a front garden and a spacious backyard where Richard had grown tomatoes and peppers. During the drive, Deborah tried to get Stephen to share more about the secret the brothers had kept, but he remained silent, only repeating that it was better for her to discover everything through the envelope Richard had left. Stephen, at least tell me if this is something that could hurt our family. Deborah, what happened in 1987 changed a lot of lives. Richard and I made a decision back then that we thought was best for everyone, but now I realize maybe we were wrong. Deborah's heart raced. 1987 had been an important year for the family. When Michael was born, when Richard got the promotion that let them buy the house, when she had to stop working to care for the baby. What could have happened that year that was so secret? They arrived at the house, and Deborah opened the door with trembling hands. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the bustle of the wake. She could almost hear echoes of the life they'd built there, the laughter of children playing in the living room, dinner table conversations, the monthly bill discussions. The attic is this way, Deborah said, pointing to a wooden staircase leading upstairs. They climbed in silence. The attic was a small space filled with old belongings, off-season clothes, and family keepsakes. In the right corner, exactly where Richard had mentioned in his letter, was a worn cardboard box full of photos from different eras of the family. Deborah carefully moved the box aside and found a sealed manila envelope with her name written in Richard's familiar handwriting. Here it is, she whispered. Stephen stepped closer and placed a hand on Deborah's shoulder. Are you sure you want to do this now? We could go back to the wake and you could read it later when you're calmer. No, Stephen. I've waited long enough. I need to know now. Deborah carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several handwritten pages and some old photographs. She began to read. My dearest Deborah, if you're reading this letter, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you in person what I should have told you long ago. I beg your forgiveness for my cowardice and hope that after learning the truth, you might find it in your heart to forgive me. In March 1987, when you were pregnant with Michael and going through that difficult phase with morning sickness and complications, I made the biggest mistake of my life. One night, after a silly argument we had about money, I left the house upset and went drinking at Joe's. I ended up drinking more than I should have, and on my way home, I hit a person who was crossing the dark road on the outskirts of town. It was Jennifer Miller, a 35-year-old woman who left behind 2 young children. I stopped the car and saw she was badly hurt. My first instinct was to call an ambulance, but then I thought of you, the baby we were expecting, and our family's future. I was afraid that if I were arrested, I'd lose my job and our lives would fall apart. Stephen arrived at the accident scene just minutes later, returning from a work trip. He helped me take Jennifer to the hospital, but it was already too late. Together, we decided not to tell anyone about my involvement in the accident. Stephen used his connections to have the case filed as a hit and run with no driver identification. All these years, I've sent money anonymously to Jennifer's children through Stephen, who lived in Chicago and could do so without raising suspicion. Deborah, I know there's no forgiveness for what I did. I took the life of a mother and deprived 2 children of growing up with theirs. But I need you to know that not a single day has passed without me thinking of her and her children. Every extra dollar I earned over the years went to them. Jennifer's children are named Jason and Sarah. They're now 28 and 26 years old. Jason graduated as an engineer and Sarah is a teacher. They were raised by their maternal grandmother and never knew where the money that helped them through school came from. Stephen advised me countless times to tell the truth, especially to you. That's why we fought and didn't speak for so long. He said you deserved to know and that Jennifer's children deserved to know the truth about what happened to their mother. Now, with my health failing, I finally understand he was right. You and our children deserve to know who I really am. And Jason and Sarah deserve the chance to forgive, or not forgive, the man who killed their mother. In the envelope, you'll find Jennifer's children's addresses and phone numbers, along with all the details about the money I sent them over the years. Deborah, I know you may never forgive me. I know this might shatter the image our children have of me. But I can't leave this world carrying this secret alone. If you decide to tell Michael and Emily, ask them to understand that everything I did after the accident was out of love for our family. That doesn't justify it, but maybe it explains why I acted as I did. I love you more than anything in this life. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And I hope that one day you'll be able to remember the good times we shared without them being overshadowed by this terrible moment. Forgive me if you can. Forever yours, Richard. Deborah Lett. The pages slipped from her hands and sank to the floor of the attic. She felt as if the world had collapsed around her. The man she had been married to for over 40 years, the father of her children, the man she admired for his honesty and character, had killed someone in an accident and hidden it his entire life. Deborah, whispered Stephen, crouching beside her. I know this is very hard to accept. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Why did you keep this secret for so long? Because Richard begged me not to. He said, you were pregnant, dealing with complications, and the news could harm you and the baby. Then when Michael was born, he said he needed time to find the right way to tell you. The years passed and it became harder and harder to reveal the truth. Deborah picked up the photographs from the envelope. One of them showed Jennifer Miller Taylor smiling with 2 young children. She was a beautiful woman, with brown hair and gentle eyes, who appeared to be about the same age Deborah had been at the time. What was she like? Murmured Deborah, touching the photograph tenderly. She was a hard-working woman, a seamstress. She raised her children alone after her husband left her when Sarah was born. Richard found out all about her family's story, and that's why he decided to support the children financially. Deborah looked at a second, more recent photograph, showing 2 smiling young adults. The young man was tall and dark-haired, with a kind smile, while the young woman had long dark hair and a serene expression. Are these Jason and Sarah now? Yes. Stephen has kept in discreet contact with them over the years to deliver the money and check on how they were doing. They're good people, Deborah. They managed to overcome the tragedy and build decent lives. Deborah slowly stood up from the floor, still holding the photographs. I need to meet them. I need to apologize on Richard's behalf. Deborah, think carefully about what you're saying. They don't know the money came from the man who killed their mother. Finding out could be very traumatic. And keeping the lie is the solution? Deborah turned to Stephen with determination. No, Stephen. 35 years of lies is enough. It's time to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Deborah placed the letters and photographs back into the envelope and walked down from the attic with steady steps. Stephen followed silently, worried about the consequences of her decision. Where are you going? He asked when Deborah picked up the car keys. First, I'm going back to the funeral home to tell Michael and Emily everything. Then I'll look for Jason and Sarah. Deborah, at least wait until after the funeral. Let Richard rest in peace before we dredge up the past. Richard won't rest in peace until this secret is revealed. Now I understand why Whiskers was so desperate. He sensed something was wrong, something that needed to be resolved. On the Abidam, way back to the funeral home, Deborah thought about how she would break the news to her children. Michael was a practical and fair man who had always looked up to his father as a model of honesty. Emily was more emotional and would likely be devastated to learn Richard had hidden something so grave. But Deborah knew she had no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful. When they arrived at the funeral home, the situation was even more chaotic. Whiskers had grown even more agitated and was now frantically scratching the coffin, as if trying to open it. Several people had left the room because the noise of his meowing had become unbearable. "Mom, thank goodness you're back," said Emily, rushing toward Deborah. "Whiskers is going crazy. We've tried everything to calm him down, but nothing works." Michael approached with a worried expression. "What did you find at home?" From Uncle Stephen's look, it wasn't good news. Deborah looked at her two children, and then at the cat, who continued its desperate meowing. It was as if Whiskers knew the secret was about to be revealed and was trying to speed up the process. "Michael, Emily, I need to tell you something very important. It's about your father and something that happened a long time ago." Deborah asked all the visitors to leave the room, keeping only close family and Father Patrick. She sat in a chair and took a deep breath before beginning the story that would forever change everyone's perception of Richard Wilson. In 1987, when Michael was still a baby, your father was involved in a car accident that killed a woman named Jennifer Miller Taylor. The silence that followed was broken only by Whiskers' persistent meows. Michael and Emily stared at their mother with expressions of shock and disbelief. "That can't be true," Emily whispered. "Dad would never do something like that." "Unfortunately, it is true, sweetheart. I have the letter he wrote explaining everything." Deborah spent the next 20 minutes recounting all the details of Richard's confession. She spoke about the accident, how Stephen had helped cover up the truth, and the money that had been sent anonymously to Jennifer's children all these years. Michael listened in silence, his face growing more serious. Emily cried uncontrollably, shaking her head in denial. "I can't believe Dad did this," she repeated through tears. "He always taught us to be honest, to own up to our mistakes." "That's exactly why he suffered so much all these years," Deborah explained. "He knew he had betrayed his own principles and couldn't live with that contradiction." Michael stood from his chair and walked over to the casket where Whiskers continued meowing. "So now, Mum, what do we do with this information?" "We do what your father didn't have the courage to do. We tell the truth to Jason and Sarah, Jennifer's children." "Mom," Emily said, wiping her tears, "this could destroy their lives. They've built their lives without knowing the truth. Why stir this up now?" "Because they have the right to know, Emily. And because your father specifically asked for the truth to be revealed if he couldn't do it himself." Father Patrick, who had listened to the entire confession in silence, stepped closer to the family. "Deborah, I know this is a very difficult decision, but I believe Richard was right. Forgiveness can only come when the truth is known. If you decide to tell Jennifer's children, I'll be here to help however I can." Stephen, who had remained quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Deborah, Jason and Sarah still live here in Riverdale. After they graduated, they decided to return to the town where they were born. Jason works for the city's construction company, and Sarah teaches at the public school. Do you still keep in touch with them?" "Yes, but they don't know who I really am. To them, I'm just a family acquaintance who helped them financially out of respect for their mother's memory." Deborah felt a pang in her heart. Jason and Sarah had grown up in the same town as her children, attended the same schools, walked the same streets, never knowing they were so close to the man who had caused the greatest tragedy of their lives. "I want to meet them today," Deborah said firmly. "Mom, it's the day before Dad's funeral," Michael protested. "This isn't the best time." "Son, your father spent the last years of his life tormented by this secret. He won't rest in peace until this is resolved." As if understanding Deborah's words, Whiskers suddenly stopped meowing and sat on the casket, staring intently at her. It was the first time since the wake began that the animal had stayed quiet. "See?" said Deborah, pointing at the cat. "Even Whiskers understands what needs to be done." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. Stephen sighed deeply and pulled his phone from his pocket. "All right, Deborah, I'll call them and ask if they can see us tonight. But I'll only say it's an important matter related to their mother's memory." As Stephen made the call, Deborah watched Whiskers, who now seemed calmer but still alert, as if waiting for what would happen next. "Jason said they can meet Gus at 8 tonight," Stephen informed them after hanging up. "They're curious and a little worried about what could be so urgent." Deborah glanced at the clock. It was 6:30 in the evening. The wake was scheduled to end at 8, exactly when they were supposed to meet Jennifer's children. "Father Patrick, would it be possible to end the wake a little earlier today?" "Of course, Deborah. I'll perform the final rites now and let everyone go." During the closing ceremony, Whiskers remained silently seated on the casket, as if he had finally found the peace he'd been seeking. It was as if the cat knew his mission to reveal the secret was nearly complete. After all the visitors had left, Deborah approached the casket and gently touched Whiskers' head. "Thank you, my little cat. You knew from the start there was something that needed to be settled, didn't you?" The cat rubbed against Deborah's hand and let out a soft meow, nothing like the desperate cries he'd made all day. Deborah, Michael, Emily, and Stephen left the funeral home and headed to the address Stephen had written down. The house where Jason and Sarah lived was in the Pinehurst neighborhood, a simpler part of town with small but well-kept homes. During the drive, Deborah tried to imagine how the meeting would go. How would two people react upon learning that the man they'd considered an anonymous benefactor, their whole lives was actually responsible for the greatest family tragedy they'd ever faced? "Mom," Michael said, breaking the silence. "Are you sure you want to do this? There's still time to turn back." "I'm sure, son. Your father suffered for 35 years carrying this burden alone. It's time to share it with the people who most deserve to know the truth." They arrived at Jason and Sarah's house right at 8. It was a modest, light blue home with a small but tidy front garden. The living room light was on, and through the window, they could see two people waiting. Anxiously, Stephen rang the bell, and a young brunette opened the door. Deborah immediately recognized Sarah from the photos she'd seen. She truly had her mother's gentle eyes and a kind smile that made Deborah's heart ache. "Good evening, Mr. Stephen," Sarah said. "Please come in, Jason's in the living room." They stepped into a small but cozy room decorated with family photos and a few books scattered on the coffee table. Jason rose from the couch to greet them. He was a tall, strong, young man with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. "Good evening," he said, looking curiously at Deborah, Michael, and Emily. "Mr. Stephen mentioned you had something important to discuss about our mother." Deborah's legs trembled. She was finally face to face with the children of the woman her husband had killed in an accident. They seemed like good, hard-working people who had overcome tragedy and built respectable lives, exactly as Stephen had described. "Jason, Sarah," Stephen said with a choked voice. "This is Deborah Wilson and her children, Michael and Emily. They need to tell you something very important about what really happened to your mother." Jason and Sarah exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean, what really happened?" Sarah asked. "We know our mother was hit by a driver who fled. The case was never solved." Deborah took a deep breath and sat in the chair Jason had offered. "That's what I came to talk to you about. The driver who hit your mother was my husband, Richard Wilson. He passed away yesterday from heart problems and left a letter confessing everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Jason slowly sat on the couch as if his legs could no longer hold him. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, just as the people at the funeral had done when they saw Whiskers meowing over the casket. Is this true?" Jason whispered. "Unfortunately, it is, son," Deborah replied, using the word son without realizing it. "My husband drank that night after an argument we had, and ended up hitting your mother on the road. He stopped to help, but it was already too late." Sarah began to cry silently. "And why are you telling us this now after so many years?" "Because Richard couldn't live in peace with this secret. All these years he anonymously sent money to help you through Stephen. Every penny you received for school, for your degrees, to buy this house, it came from him." Jason abruptly stood up. "Are you saying the man who killed our mother was the same one who supported us financially our whole lives?" "Yes," Stephen answered. "Richard felt guilty and wanted to make sure you had the opportunities your mother would have wanted to give you." "But that's insane," Jason exploded. "How could he think money would make up for what he did?" Deborah stood and stepped closer to him. "He didn't think it would, Jason. He knew nothing in the world could make up for losing your mother. But it was the only way he found to try to ease even just a little the pain he had caused." Sarah wiped her tears and looked straight at Deborah. "Where is he now? We want to talk to him." "He passed away yesterday, sweetheart. The wake was today. In fact, that's how we found out about the secret. He left me a letter explaining everything." Jason began pacing the room, clearly struggling to process everything he'd heard. "I can't believe this. All these years, we thought there was just some kind person in the world helping us out of pure generosity, and it was actually the man who destroyed our family." "Jason," Michael said, speaking for the first time, "I know how you feel. We just found out today too. Our father was always our example of honesty and integrity. Learning he carried a secret like this his whole life has been devastating for us too." Sarah stood and walked to a shelf where a framed photo of Jennifer with her 2 young children sat. "Our mother was a wonderful woman," she said, touching the photo tenderly. "She worked as a seamstress, woke up at 5 in the morning to finish orders before taking us to school. She dreamed of seeing us graduate, owning a home, traveling to see the ocean." Tears streamed down Deborah's face. "I'm sure she'd be proud to see who you've become. Jason, an engineer. Sarah, a teacher. You've achieved the dreams she had for you." "But she's not here to see it," Jason shouted. "She missed the chance to watch us grow up, to meet our friends, to give us advice, to be a grandmother to our children." Jason's sobs were heartbreaking. Deborah had never seen a grown man cry with such pain, and she felt responsible for causing even more suffering to people who had already been through so much. "Jason, I know nothing I say will bring your mother back or ease the pain you felt all these years, but I needed you to know the truth. You deserve the chance to forgive or not forgive. You deserve to decide what to do with this information." Sarah stepped closer to Deborah and surprised her by taking her hands. "Mrs. Wilson, I know you're not to blame for what your husband did, and I know it must have been so hard to discover this about someone you loved. How can you both be so generous after everything that happened?" Deborah asked, amazed by Sarah's maturity. "Our grandmother taught us that hatred only hurts the one who hates," Sarah replied. "Our mother wouldn't have wanted us to grow bitter because of the tragedy that happened to her." Jason sat back down and took several deep breaths before speaking. "I need time to process all this. My whole life I hated the driver who hit our mother. I imagined he was a cruel man who didn't care about the consequences of his actions. To find out he cared so much, he sent us money for decades. It confuses everything I ever felt." "Jason," Emily said, speaking for the first time, "our family is also dealing with confusing feelings. We loved our father, but now we have to accept he wasn't perfect, that he made a terrible mistake when he was young, and spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it." Stephen, who had stayed quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Jason, Sarah, I'd also like to ask for your forgiveness. I helped Richard cover up the truth all these years. I tried many times to convince him to tell you, but maybe I should have taken the initiative to reveal the secret myself." Sarah looked at Stephen thoughtfully. "Mr. Stephen, all these years, when you came to deliver the money, we always felt there was something more behind your generosity. You always seemed so emotional when you spoke about our mother. Because I knew the whole story, Sarah. Every time I saw how well you were growing up, how you were overcoming hardships, I felt both relieved and guilty. Relieved because the money was truly helping, and guilty because you deserved to know the truth." Jason stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where he'd grown up. "Do you know where our mother is buried?" Deborah was surprised by the question. "I assume it's at Riverside Cemetery." "Why?" "Because we could never give her a proper burial. We were too young and our grandmother couldn't afford a decent grave. She was buried in a common plot." Deborah's heart broke hearing this. Richard had sent so much money to Jennifer's children over the years, but he'd never thought to provide a proper burial for the woman he'd killed. "Jason, if you'll allow me, I'd like to arrange a proper grave for your mother. It's the least I can do to honor her memory." Jason turned to Deborah with tear-filled eyes. "You'd do that?" "I would. And I'd like you both to help us choose the location and the type of grave. Your mother deserves to be remembered with dignity." Sarah stepped forward and hugged Deborah, surprising everyone. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. That would mean so much to us." Michael and Emily watched the scene with emotion. They were seeing their mother trying to make amends in some way for the mistake their father had made so many years ago. "Mrs. Wilson," said Jason, "I have a question that might sound strange." "Go ahead, dear. How did you find out about the secret? I mean, what made you look for those letters today?" Deborah smiled for the first time since discovering the truth. "It was because of Whiskers, my husband's cat. During the entire wake, he kept meowing desperately on top of the casket, as if he was trying to tell us something. That's what made us realize something was wrong, something that needed to be resolved." Jason and Sarah exchanged glances, intrigued. "A cat?" Sarah asked. "Yes. Whiskers was very attached to Richard. When my husband started getting sick, the cat grew restless too, as if he sensed something bad was about to happen. Today, during the wake, he wouldn't stop meowing on top of the casket. That's what made us suspect there was a secret that needed to be revealed." "What an incredible story," Jason murmured. "It's like the cat knew the truth needed to come out." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly woman who walked into the house without knocking. She was clearly family, since Jason and Sarah didn't seem surprised by her presence. "Grandma Margaret," Sarah said. "You came at just the right time. These people have something important to tell us about our mother." Deborah looked at the woman and immediately noticed the resemblance between her and Jennifer through the photographs she had seen. Mrs. Campbell must have been about 75, with completely white hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "Good evening," Mrs. Campbell said, greeting everyone politely. "Forgive the intrusion, but I saw visitors and got curious." Jason walked over to his grandmother and put an arm around her shoulders. "Grandma, sit here. We have a lot to tell you." For the next 30 minutes, Deborah, Michael, Emily, and Stephen repeated the whole story to Mrs. Campbell. The elderly woman listened in silence, her expression a mix of sadness, surprise, and what seemed like relief. "So, that's how it happened," she murmured when the story ended. "After 35 years, I finally know what really happened to my daughter." "Grandma," Sarah said, concerned, "how are you feeling?" Mrs. Campbell took a deep breath and looked at Deborah. "You know, my dear, all these years, I always felt something was strange about Jennifer's accident. The police said it was a hit and run, but they never found any leads. Then when we started receiving that money through Stephen, I suspected it might be connected to the accident. Everyone was surprised by Mrs. Campbell's revelation." "You suspected?" Stephen asked. "Of course I did. Who sends money anonymously for decades to a family they don't know? There had to be a strong reason behind it. I always thought it might be guilt." Deborah was impressed by the elderly woman's insight. "And why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because the money helped. My grandchildren have a better life. They were able to study, graduate, buy this house. If I had investigated and found out it was dirty money, I would have had to refuse it. And then Jason and Sarah wouldn't have had the opportunities they did." Jason looked at his grandmother with admiration. "Grandma, you knew and never told us. My dear, you were so young when we started receiving the money. Later, when you grew up, I decided it was better to let you live your lives without carrying the weight of another tragedy. You'd already lost your mother too soon." Sarah knelt beside her grandmother's chair. "And now, Grandma, what do you think we should do?" Mrs. Campbell looked at each person in the room before answering. "Now, I think we should finally Let Jennifer rest in peace. She was always a woman who believed in forgiveness. If she were here, I'm sure she would forgive Richard, especially knowing he spent 35 years suffering for what he did. Deborah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Hearing those words from Jennifer's mother was like receiving a blessing she didn't even know she was waiting for. "Mrs. Campbell, are you sure about this?" "Yes, my dear. Jennifer always taught us that holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Richard has suffered enough, and you, his family, aren't to blame for the mistakes he made." Jason sat on the floor beside his grandmother and took her hand. "Grandma, I'm still confused about all this. Part of me wants to be angry, but another part understands that holding on to hate won't bring our mum back." "That's exactly it, my boy. Your mother won't return, but you can choose how you'll live from now on. You can choose hate or you can choose forgiveness." Sarah joined her brother on the floor. "I choose forgiveness, Grandma. I can't spend the rest of my life hating a man who's already dead and who clearly regretted what he did." Deborah began to cry with emotion. She was witnessing something she never thought possible, people who had lost their mother in such a tragic way choosing forgiveness over revenge. "Jason?" Mrs. Campbell asked, looking at her grandson. Jason stayed, silent for a few minutes, clearly wrestling with his emotions. "It's hard, Grandma. My whole life I imagined that if I ever found the man who killed our mom, I'd take justice into my own hands. But now, knowing he spent decades punishing himself, that he helped us financially without even knowing us, I don't know how to feel." "You don't have to know how to feel right now," Sarah said, touching her brother's arm. "But we can start by choosing not to feed the hate." Michael stepped closer to Jason. "If it means anything, I want you to know. Our father was always a good man. What he did was terrible, but it doesn't define who he was as a person. He taught us to be honest, to help those in need, to own up to our mistakes. The irony is that the one mistake he couldn't face was the biggest of all." "Michael," Jason said, looking him in the eye, "you and your family aren't to blame for what your father did. And I don't want our family to carry hate for yours." The two families kept talking late into the night. They shared stories about Richard and Jennifer, talked about how the tragedy had affected their lives and the dreams they had for the future. Around 2 in the morning, Deborah stood up to leave. "Jason, Sarah, Mrs. Campbell, I'd like to invite you somewhere." "What kind of invitation?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow is Richard's funeral. I know it might seem strange, but I'd like you to be there. Not to publicly forgive or make a scene, but so he can finally rest in peace knowing the truth has been revealed." Jason and Sarah exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the invitation. "Mrs. Wilson," Jason said, "I don't know if we could be there. It would be too hard to see the burial of the man who killed our mom. I completely understand. It's just an invitation, not an obligation. You should only do what feels right for you." Mrs. Campbell stood up with her grandson's help. "I'll be there," she said, surprising everyone. "Grandma?" Sarah asked, confused. "Yes, I want to see Richard buried to be sure this story has finally come to an end. And I want to be there to support his family, who are suffering just as much as we did 35 years ago." Deborah Wilson embraced Mrs. Campbell with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Campbell. This means so much to me." "I'll go too," said Sarah, making the decision suddenly. "If my grandmother is going to be there, I'll be with her." Jason hesitated for a few seconds before speaking. I'll go too. I think I need to see this to move forward." The two families said their goodbyes with heartfelt hugs. It was hard to believe that in just one night, people who had never met before had become united by a tragedy from the past and the choice to forgive rather than hate. On the drive home, Michael broke the silence in the car. "Mom, I still can't believe everything that happened today." "Neither can I, son. When I woke up this morning, I was just a widow going to my husband's wake. Now I'm the wife of a man who killed someone and hid it his whole life. How do you feel about Dad now?" asked Emily. Deborah thought for a few minutes before answering. "I'm disappointed by the lie, honey. Very disappointed. But I'm also proud of how he tried to make things right. Sending money for decades, making sure Jason and Sarah had good opportunities in life. It doesn't erase what he did, but it shows he never stopped caring." And now, Mum, how do we move forward knowing this? We keep being honest, Michael. We'll honor your father's memory by doing the right things he taught us, and we'll learn from the mistake he made. And we'll stay in touch with Jennifer's family, because now they're part of our story too. They arrived home around 3 in the morning. Deborah was exhausted but knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. There were too many emotions and thoughts swirling in her head. She sat in the kitchen and made tea, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a woman married for over 40 years. Today, she was a widow, carrying the weight of a secret that would forever change how she saw the past. But strangely, Deborah also felt a kind of peace. The secret had been revealed, the truth had been told, and the people most affected by the tragedy had chosen forgiveness. Maybe Richard could finally rest in peace. The day of the funeral dawned rainy, which seemed fitting for the occasion. Deborah woke up early and prepared everything for the ceremony, choosing a simple black dress that Richard had always liked. Michael and Emily arrived early to help with the final arrangements. Both looked tired and emotionally drained from the events of the day before. "Mom," said Emily, "do you really think they'll come to the funeral?" "I don't know, honey, but if they do, we'll welcome them with respect and gratitude." The ceremony was scheduled for 10 in the morning at St. Joseph's Church, followed by the burial at Riverside Cemetery. Deborah had chosen a simple plot for the burial, near a large tree where Richard could rest in the shade, as he always said he'd like. At 9:30, as Deborah was arriving at the church, she saw a group of 3 people walking toward her. It was Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell, all dressed in black, with solemn but respectful expressions. "You came," Deborah said, moved. "We promised we would," Sarah replied, "and we always keep our promises." The ceremony was simple and emotional. Father Patrick spoke about forgiveness, about how everyone makes mistakes, and the importance of learning from our failures. Though he didn't specifically mention Richard's situation, his words seemed meant for everyone present who knew the truth. Throughout the service, Whiskers remained calm beside the casket. The cat that had been so restless the day before now seemed at peace, as if it knew its mission had been accomplished. At the cemetery, Deborah was surprised to see Jason and Sarah had brought flowers to place on Richard's grave. "Why did you bring flowers?" she asked, touched by the gesture. "Because," Jason said, "regardless of what he did, he was an important person in our lives. The money he sent allowed us to have an education, opportunities, a better life. That deserves recognition." After the coffin was buried and most people had left, the 2 families remained at the cemetery talking. "Mrs. Wilson," said Mrs. Campbell, "I'd like to show you where Jennifer is buried." Deborah, Michael, and Emily followed Mrs. Campbell, Jason, and Sarah to an older section of the cemetery, where there were several simple graves, some unmarked. "Here," Mrs. Campbell said, stopping in front of a plot marked only with a number. "This is where my daughter was buried." Deborah's heart tightened at the simplicity of the place. There was no headstone, no flowers, nothing to indicate that. A woman who had been loved and had left behind children was buried there. "Mrs. Campbell, Jason, Sarah," Deborah said firmly, "I'd like to keep the promise I made yesterday. Let's arrange a proper grave for Jennifer Miller. Will you help me choose one?" "It would be an honor," Sarah replied, tears in her eyes. Deborah spent the next 2 weeks organizing the construction of a beautiful grave for Jennifer Miller. She chose white marble with a simple inscription, "Jennifer Miller Taylor, beloved mother, forever in our hearts." On the day of the grave's unveiling, the 2 families gathered again at the cemetery. Mrs. Campbell brought a photograph of Jennifer to place on the headstone, while Deborah brought fresh flowers. "Now she has a dignified place to rest," Jason murmured, gently touching the headstone. "And now both families can finally find peace," Sarah added. In the weeks that followed, Deborah kept in regular contact with Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell. She discovered they had much in common, and that the tragedy that had brought them together had also forged genuine bonds of friendship. Jason offered to help Deborah with some home repairs as he worked in construction. Sarah began visiting Deborah regularly to chat and have coffee, especially since she noticed the widow was feeling very lonely. 2 months after the funeral, Deborah made a decision that surprised everyone. she decided to officially adopt Whiskers, even though the cat had lived with her for years. "Why do you want to adopt Whiskers now?" Emily asked. "Because he's the one who helped us uncover the truth. If it weren't for him, your father would have taken that secret to the grave, and we never would have met Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell. Whiskers deserves to be recognized as the hero of this whole story." Deborah organized a small ceremony at home to celebrate Whiskers' official adoption. She invited Michael, Emily, Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell. She baked a cake and decorated the house with colorful ribbons. "Today, we're not just celebrating Whiskers' adoption," Deborah said to everyone present, "but also the fact that two families, separated by tragedy, have found each other again through love and forgiveness." Whiskers, as if understanding the importance of the moment, affectionately rubbed against each person present, purring loudly and seeming genuinely happy. During the celebration, Jason made an announcement that moved everyone. "Mrs. Wilson, Sarah and I have decided to start a social project in memory of our mother and your Richard. We want to help underprivileged families in town with education and job opportunities." "What a wonderful idea," exclaimed Deborah. "Can I help in any way?" "Actually," said Sarah, "we'd like you to be our partner in the project. You know the town and the people who need help the best." Deborah felt a wave of emotion filling her chest. After months of pain and difficult revelations, she finally saw something positive emerging from the whole situation. "I'd be delighted to accept," she replied. "I think it would be a beautiful way to honor the memory of both Jennifer and Richard." Mrs. Campbell walked over to Deborah and took her hands. "My dear, Jennifer would be so proud to know her story helped bring people together and create something good for the community." "And Richard would be happy too," added Michael. "He always wanted to help people, but never knew how to do it in an organized way." The social project was named the Jennifer and Richard Foundation and began its work 3 months later. Deborah donated part of the savings she had built with Richard over the years, while Jason and Sarah contributed their time and professional expertise. The foundation offered vocational training, help for children struggling in school, and support for families in vulnerable situations. It quickly became a cornerstone in the town, helping dozens of families improve their lives. A year after the secret was revealed, Deborah organized a special ceremony at the cemetery. It was the anniversary of the day the truth came out, and she wanted to mark the occasion meaningfully. She gathered with Michael, Emily, Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell at the graves of Richard and Jennifer, which were relatively close to each other. Each person brought a flower to place on the tombstones. "A year ago, we uncovered a secret that could have torn our families apart," said Deborah. "But we chose to turn that discovery into something positive. We chose forgiveness over hatred, unity over division." "And today," added Jason, "we can say Richard and our mother are finally at peace. They met in tragedy, but their legacies have come together to help others." Sarah placed a white rose on Jennifer's grave. "Mom, your son and daughter are doing well. We found it in our hearts to forgive and gained a new family who loves and supports us. The foundation we created in your memory has already helped over 100 families in town." Deborah placed a red rose on Richard's grave. "Richard, my love, your secret was revealed and your actions were forgiven. Jason and Sarah have become like children to me, just as Michael and Emily have become like children to Mrs. Campbell. The family you feared losing has grown larger and stronger." Whiskers, who had followed everyone to the cemetery, sat between the two graves and let out a soft meow as if offering his own farewell. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years after the secret came to light, Deborah's life had completely changed. She had spent 40 years as just a wife and mother, but now she was the president of a social foundation recognized throughout the region. More importantly, she had found a new family in Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell. The foundation had grown significantly and now served not just Riverdale, but neighboring towns as well. Deborah discovered she had a natural talent for organizing and coordinating social projects. skills she'd never had the chance to develop during her marriage. "Mom," Michael said during a Sunday lunch, "you seem happier now than I've seen you in years." "It's true, son. For the longest time I thought my life was over when your father passed away. But discovering the truth and deciding to do something positive with it gave me a new purpose." Emily, who had grown very close to Sarah, added, "And we gained a bigger, closer family." Who would have thought a tragedy from 35 years ago could result in so much love and unity? During that lunch, Jason arrived with news that left everyone emotional. "Everyone, I have something important to tell you." "What is it?" asked Sarah, curious. "I got an offer to move to Chicago and work for a big construction company there. It's a really good financial opportunity." A silence fell over the table. Everyone knew it was a great opportunity for Jason, but they also knew they would miss him terribly. "And will you accept it?" asked Deborah, trying to hide the sadness in her voice. "That's the thing. 2 years ago I would have accepted without a second thought. But now I have a family here. I have the foundation. I have responsibilities and people I love. I don't know if I want to leave all that behind." Sarah held her brother's hand. "Jason, you can't make a decision based just on us. This could be the chance of a lifetime. But you are my life," he replied, emotional. "For years we only had each other. Now we have a bigger family, work that helps people, roots." Here, Deborah stood up from the table and hugged Jason. "Son, if you decide to stay, we'll be very happy. But if you decide to go, we'll support your decision and stay in touch always. What matters is that you do what you think is best for your future." "Mrs. Wilson, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. If Richard were alive, what would he advise me to do?" Deborah thought for a few minutes before answering. "Richard always said family is the most important thing in the world, but that everyone needs to follow their own path. He'd tell me to advise you to follow your heart, but without forgetting you'll always have a family here waiting for you." Jason smiled and hugged Deborah. "Then I'll stay. My heart is here, with all of you, with the foundation, with everything we've built together." Jason's decision sparked a spontaneous celebration. Mrs. Campbell, who had arrived during the conversation, was moved to hear her grandson had chosen to prioritize family. "Jason," she said, "your mother would be proud to know you chose love over money." That same afternoon, the two families decided to take a special outing. They visited the municipal lake in Riverdale, a beautiful spot where they used to have weekend picnics. As they walked around the lake, Deborah watched how everyone interacted naturally, as if they had always been a close family. Michael and Jason talked about work and football. Emily and Sarah laughed at some private joke they shared. Mrs. Campbell told stories from her youth to anyone who would listen. "Whiskers," said Deborah, picking up the cat who had insisted on joining the outing. "Look what you've done. Because of your meowing that day at the funeral, we discovered the truth and gained a new family." Whiskers purred and rubbed against Deborah's face, as if understanding exactly what she was saying. "You know," said Sarah, walking up to Deborah, "sometimes I think about what our lives would have been like if we'd never discovered the truth about the accident." "What do you mean?" "Well, we'd still be getting the money anonymously, not knowing where it came from. You'd still just be the widow of a man you thought you knew completely. And we would have never met." Deborah reflected on Sarah's words. "That's true. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. Even if it hurts at first, it lets people make decisions based on reality. And it allows forgiveness to truly happen," added Jason. "It's hard to forgive someone when you don't exactly know what you need to forgive." During their walk, they met several townspeople who warmly greeted Deborah and her adopted children. The foundation had become well known in the area, and everyone admired the work the two families were doing together. Mrs. Wilson said, "Mr. Jenkins, a local shopkeeper, my granddaughter received a scholarship through the foundation. I don't know how to thank you for the work you're doing." "There's no need to thank me, Mr. Jenkins. It's our duty to help those in need." After the shopkeeper walked away, Jason remarked, "Mrs. Wilson, do you realize how much people respect you, how they see you as a role model in town?" "I never thought about that, son." "Well, you should. You've become a community leader, someone people turn to when they need help or advice." Deborah grew thoughtful. Over the past few weeks, many had sought her help with family issues, work problems, and financial struggles. She had become an informal counselor for the community. Maybe it's because I went through something very difficult and managed to overcome it, she reflected. People know I understand what it means to suffer and start over. That's exactly it, said Emily. You've become an example of how to turn pain into strength, how to use tragedy to help others. When they returned home that evening, a surprise awaited them. An envelope with the town hall seal was left at Deborah's door. What could this be? Asked Michael, picking up the envelope. Deborah opened it and read aloud. Dear Mrs. Deborah Wilson, the Riverdale Town Hall is honored to invite you to receive the title of Honorary Citizen of our town in recognition of the exceptional work you have carried out through the Jennifer and Richard Foundation. The ceremony will take place on December 15th at 7 p.m. in the Town Hall's Grand Hall. Sincerely, Mayor William Johnson. Everyone was moved by the invitation. Deborah especially felt honored by such recognition. Mom, you absolutely deserve this, exclaimed Emily. We all deserve it, Deborah corrected. This work only exists because we chose to do it together, as a family. Mrs. Wilson, Jason asked, are you going to accept the title? Yes, I will. But at the ceremony, I'll make it clear that this recognition belongs to everyone who made the foundation possible. The award ceremony was unforgettable. The town hall's grand hall was packed with community members who had benefited from the foundation. Deborah wore a navy blue dress that Sarah had helped pick out, and she felt beautiful and worthy of the honor she was receiving. During her acceptance speech, Deborah shared part of the story behind the foundation's creation, naturally omitting the more intimate details about Richard's secret. This title isn't just mine, she told the audience. It belongs to Jason Miller, who brought expertise and dedication to our work. It belongs to Sarah Miller, who turned education into a tool for social change. It belongs to Mrs. Campbell, who taught us that wisdom comes from experience. It belongs to my children, Michael and Emily, who supported our mission unconditionally. And it belongs to all of you, who trusted our work and let us make a difference in your lives. The audience gave a standing ovation, and Deborah was genuinely moved. She looked to the front row, where her biological and adopted children sat, and saw tears of pride in all their eyes. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Deborah received greetings from people she didn't even know, but who had been touched by the foundation's work. Mrs. Wilson, said an elderly woman who approached her, my grandson got into college thanks to the tutoring he received at the foundation. He'll be the first in our family to go to university. How wonderful, Deborah replied, genuinely happy. And what will he study? Engineering, just like Jason. He said he wants to help build homes for people in need when he graduates. Deborah smiled, thinking about how Jason had become an inspiration for the town's youth. During the reception, the mayor approached Deborah with an unexpected proposal. Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to talk to you about the possibility of expanding the foundation to other towns in the region. How so, Mayor? Several neighboring towns have reached out to our administration, wanting to know how to replicate the work you're doing here. There's interest in creating a network of similar foundations across the region. Deborah was surprised by the proposal. She had never imagined their work could have an impact beyond Riverdale. It's an interesting proposal, Mayor, but I'd need to discuss it with my team before giving an answer. Of course, Mrs. Wilson, there's no rush, but know that the state is willing to provide financial resources for the expansion if you agree to lead the project. Deborah spent the following days talking with Jason, Sarah, Michael, Emily, and Mrs. Campbell about the expansion proposal. It was a unique opportunity to broaden the foundation's positive impact, but it also came with much greater responsibility. What do you all think? She asked during a family meeting. I think we should accept, said Sarah. If we've made a difference here, why not help other towns too? But do we have the capacity to manage such a large project? Michael questioned. We'll develop the capacity, Jason replied. What matters is the willingness to help, and we have plenty of that. Mrs. Campbell, as always, offered the wisest perspective. My dears, when Jennifer and Richard left this world, they left behind immense pain. But you've turned that pain into love, that love into action, and that action into social change. If now you have the chance to bring that change to more people, I believe you should take it." "So, are we all in agreement?" Deborah asked. Everyone confirmed, and Deborah called the mayor to accept the expansion proposal. In the months that followed, Deborah's life became even busier. She traveled regularly to other towns in the region, helping to implement new foundations based on the model they had created in Riverdale. Jason took charge of infrastructure and construction for the new locations. Sarah developed the educational curricula to be used across all branches. Michael handled finances and administration, while Emily coordinated communication and social marketing efforts. A year after accepting the expansion proposal, 12 foundations were operating in different towns, serving over 1,000 families in the region. Deborah had become a well-known and respected figure throughout the area, invited to give talks and participate in events on social development. During one such talk in Brookfield, Deborah met Dr. Jennifer Walker, a psychologist specializing in family therapy, who was deeply interested in the story of how the two families had come together after the secret was revealed. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Walker said after the talk, "your story is an extraordinary example of how forgiveness can turn tragedy into opportunity. I'd like to document your experience to help other families going through similar situations." "Document how?" "Write a book about your story, with your permission, of course. I believe many people could benefit from learning how you managed to overcome such a difficult situation." Deborah Wilson was intrigued by the proposal, but said she'd need to discuss it with the whole family before deciding. That evening, during family dinner, Deborah shared Dr. Jennifer Walker's suggestion. "Do you think we should agree?" Jason was the first to speak up. "Mrs. Wilson, if our story can help others, I think we should share it. But we have to be careful not to expose too many private family details," Sarah cautioned. "That's true," Michael agreed. "The story should be told in a way that inspires, not sensationalizes." Mrs. Campbell offered her opinion. "My dears, you've turned something terrible into something beautiful. If other families can learn from this, you almost have an obligation to share." "Then it's decided," Deborah said. "We'll authorize the book, but on the condition that we review the content before publication." Dr. Jennifer Walker spent the following months interviewing all members of both families, gathering details about how they'd overcome the secret's revelation and built a new family dynamic based on forgiveness and love. The book, titled Whiskers and the Secret: How a Cat Revealed the Truth That United Two Families, was published 2 years later and became an unexpected success. Many families experiencing relationship crises sought guidance from the foundation, inspired by Deborah and her family's experience. One of the book's most interesting aspects was how it highlighted Whisker's role in revealing the secret. Dr. Walker had researched animals' ability to perceive human emotions and concluded the cat had indeed sensed Richard's inner conflict and tried to communicate it during the wake. "It's amazing how animals sense things we humans ignore," Sarah remarked during the book launch. "Whiskers was always special," Deborah said, stroking the now 6-year-old cat. "He wasn't just Richard's cat. He was like Richard's conscience, always trying to keep him connected to what was right." At the launch event, Deborah was surprised by attendees who'd come specifically to meet her after reading her story. "Mrs. Wilson," said a middle-aged woman approaching her, "I read your book after discovering my husband had hidden massive debt from our family for years. Your story helped me understand forgiveness is possible, even when we feel betrayed by those we love." "Mrs. Wilson," a young man said, "my parents divorced when I was little because of my father's lie. After reading your book, I forgave him, and now we have a good relationship again." "Mrs. Wilson," an elderly woman shared, "I lost my daughter in a car accident 10 years ago and always hated the driver who caused it. Your book made me realize that hatred was destroying me more than punishing him." Deborah was moved to see how her story was genuinely helping others navigate difficult situations in their own lives. 3 years after the book's release, Deborah received an unexpected invitation. A television producer wanted to make a documentary about her story and the foundation's work. "Mrs. Wilson," the documentary director said during their meeting, Your story has all the elements of a great film: tragedy, secrets, revelation, forgiveness, social transformation. We believe a documentary could reach even more people than the book. Deborah Wilson hesitated at the proposal. The television exposure would be far greater than the books, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that level of public attention. "I need to talk to my family before deciding," she told the director. During the family meeting to discuss the documentary proposal, opinions were divided. "Mom," said Emily, "you've already done so much to help people. You don't have to put yourself out there more if you don't want to." "But Emily," Jason countered, "a documentary could inspire millions. Imagine how many families could be helped." "That's true," Sarah agreed, "and the documentary could show the Institute's practical work, attract more volunteers and donors." Michael seemed worried. "Mom, you have to think. If you accept, your life will change completely. You won't have privacy anymore. People will recognize you on the street, always asking for advice." Mrs. Campbell, now almost 80 but still sharp and engaged, gave her opinion. "Deborah, in all these years we've known each other, I've watched you transform from a homemaker into a community leader, from a grieving widow into a symbol of resilience. If you feel you still have more to give, accept the documentary. If you feel you've done enough, say no without guilt." Deborah thought for several days before making her decision. She talked to Whiskers, who remained her most faithful confidant, reflected on everything that had happened since that day at the funeral home 5 years earlier. Finally, she gathered the whole family to announce her choice. "I've decided to do the documentary, but on one condition. It must show that this isn't the story of one special person who did something extraordinary. It's the story of ordinary people who chose forgiveness over hatred, love over revenge, and it must make clear that any family can make those same choices." The documentary, "The Cat Who Revealed the Secret," was filmed over 6 months. The production team followed Deborah and her family in their daily lives, documented the Institute's work, and interviewed people helped by their social projects. One of the most emotional scenes was filmed at the cemetery, where Deborah, Jason, and Sarah visited the graves of Richard and Jennifer together. "5 years ago," Deborah told the cameras, "I learned that my husband had killed the mother of these 2 wonderful people. Today they're my children in heart, and we work together to honor the memory of both Richard and Jennifer." "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened," Jason added, "but it lets us build something new from what was broken." "Our mother always said love is stronger than pain," Sarah said. "It took a few years, but we finally understand what she meant." The documentary aired nationally and had a huge impact. Deborah began receiving invitations from across the country to speak about forgiveness, resilience, and social change. But perhaps the most important result was the dozens of similar institutes that sprang up in different states, all inspired by the model created in Riverdale. Deborah, now 68, had become a national figure in community social work. But to her, what mattered most wasn't public recognition. It was that her family had grown even closer, and thousands of lives were being touched by the work they'd started. One Sunday afternoon, Deborah was at home sorting through photographs when she found an old picture of Richard holding Whiskers in his lap. It was taken just months before his death, and in both their eyes she could see a sadness she hadn't understood at the time. "Whiskers," she said to the cat, who was now slower due to age, "look at this photo. You both knew something important was about to happen, didn't you?" Whiskers moved closer to Deborah and curled up in her lap, purring softly. Even at nearly 8 years old, he was still her most faithful confidant. "You were the hero of this whole story," she continued, stroking the cat. "If it weren't for your meowing that day, Richard's secret would have died with him, and we never would have known Jennifer's family." At that moment, Deborah had an important realization. Whiskers hadn't been trying to wake Richard that day at the funeral home. He had been trying to tell everyone there was a secret that needed to be revealed. The cat had fulfilled the mission that Richard, out of cowardice, hadn't been able to complete in life. "You kept the promise he couldn't keep," Deborah said, tears in her eyes. "You made sure the truth came out and that our families reconciled." Deborah spent the rest of the afternoon looking at old photographs, reflecting on how her life had changed over the past 5 years. From a grieving widow, she had become a nationally recognized community leader, From a small nuclear family, she had become part of an extended family built on love and forgiveness. By evening, Michael, Emily, Jason, Sarah, and Mrs. Campbell arrived for the Sunday dinner that had become a tradition. It was always a special time where they shared their week's experiences and planned future activities for the foundation. "Mom," Michael said during dinner, "do you realize our family has become a model for others across the country?" "How so, son?" "Well, through the book and the documentary, thousands of people have heard our story, and many of them are following our example. Families reconciling after difficult revelations, people choosing forgiveness over revenge, communities coming together to create social projects." Sarah nodded. "It's true, Mrs. Wilson. Last week, I got an email from a woman in Boston who said she and her sister-in-law made peace after years of fighting because of our story. And I," Jason added, "talked to a guy from Seattle who's starting a similar foundation there, inspired by our work." Deborah felt moved and proud, but also a little overwhelmed by the responsibility of being an example to so many. "Sometimes I feel pressured," she confessed, "like I have to be perfect all the time so I don't disappoint the people who look up to us." Mrs. Campbell, ever wise, replied, "My dear, no one is perfect. What makes our story special isn't perfection, it's the ability to turn flaws into growth, mistakes into lessons, pain into love." "That's exactly right, Grandma Margaret," Emily said. "Our family isn't special because we don't make mistakes, but because we know how to handle them when they happen." After dinner, they all gathered in the living room to watch a TV program, featuring Deborah's interview from the previous week. It always felt strange for her to see herself on TV, but she enjoyed watching it with her family and hearing their comments. During the interview, the host had asked what the biggest lesson was that Deborah had learned from the whole experience. "The greatest lesson," she had answered on TV, "is that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. And forgiveness isn't something we do for others. It's something we do for ourselves so we can move forward without carrying the weight of hatred." "That was a really good answer, Mom," Michael remarked. "And very true," Sarah added. "I remember how I felt after we forgave you. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders." Whiskers, who had been sleeping on the couch, suddenly woke up and began meowing softly, staring intently at the window. Deborah got up to see what had caught the cat's attention. Outside it was drizzling, and Deborah spotted a thin, wet, stray cat seeking shelter under the porch. "Oh, poor thing," she said. "He's soaked and cold." "Mom, you're not adopting another cat," Emily warned, laughing. "Why not? Whiskers needs company and this little one needs a home." Deborah opened the door and called to the stray, who hesitated for a few seconds before approaching. It was a young kitten, probably just a few months old, striped like Whiskers, but with some white patches. "Come here, little one," Deborah said, offering a saucer of milk. The kitten drank eagerly and then rubbed against Deborah's legs, purring loudly. "Looks like you've got a new family member," Jason remarked. "What are you going to name him?" Sarah asked. Deborah glanced at Whiskers, who had come closer and was sniffing the kitten curiously. "I'll call him Hope," she said. "Because that's what this little one brought here today, a reminder that there's always hope for a fresh start, for building something new, for finding a family." Whiskers seemed to approve of the name, licking the kitten's head affectionately. "Look at that," Mrs. Campbell said, moved. "Whiskers is teaching Hope how to be part of this family." Over the following weeks, Deborah trained Hope just as Richard had trained Whiskers years before. The kitten quickly adapted to the household, routine, and became Whiskers' inseparable companion. But the most remarkable thing was how Hope seemed to have inherited Whiskers' special sensitivity. Whenever Deborah was sad or worried, the kitten would curl up in her lap, purring softly. "This little one has a special gift too," Sarah remarked, during one of her visits. "Maybe Whiskers is teaching him how to sense people's emotions," Deborah suggested. 6 months after Hope's arrival, Deborah received news that made her very happy. Sarah was engaged to a teacher from the school where she worked, a young man named Kevin who had already become friends with the whole family. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said during the announcement, "I'd love for you to be my matron of honor. Deborah was touched by the request. "It would be an honor, dear, but wouldn't your grandmother be upset? Grandma Margaret is going to be Kevin's matron of honor," Sarah explained. "We thought it would be lovely to have both family matriarchs as part of the ceremony." Sarah's wedding was a special celebration for the entire extended family. Deborah felt truly proud to stand as matron of honor, wearing a pink outfit she had picked out with Emily's help. During the ceremony, Deborah thought about how Jennifer would have been so happy to see her daughter getting married, building her own family. And she thought about how Richard too would have been moved to know that his secrets had brought so much happiness to so many people. "Kevin," Deborah said during her matron of honor speech, "you're not just marrying Sarah. You're becoming part of a very special family. A family that's learned love is stronger than pain, forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and it's always possible to start over when you have people who love you by your side." 2 years after Sarah's wedding, Jason also got married, this time to Jessica, a nurse he met during one of the foundation's projects. Deborah was matron of honor again, and the ceremony was even more emotional than the first. Now Deborah had 4 children, 2 sons-in-law, and she eagerly awaited the arrival of her first grandchildren. Her house, which for so long had seemed empty after Richard's death, was now always full of visits, laughter, and conversation. Whiskers, now nearly 10 years old, had grown slower and preferred to spend most of his time napping in the sun in the backyard. Hope, at 3 years old, had taken on the role of the family's emotional guardian, always attuned to Deborah's feelings. One autumn afternoon, Deborah was in the backyard watering the plants when Whiskers approached her with a soft meow. It was different, weaker, and she could tell he wasn't feeling well. "What's wrong, my little kitty?" she asked, crouching down to pet him. Whiskers curled up in her lap and began to purr softly, but she could sense his breathing was labored. Deborah took Whiskers to the vet right away, where she learned he had age-related heart problems. The vet explained there wasn't much to do except make his remaining months as comfortable as possible. "How long does he have?" Deborah asked, tears in her eyes. "It's hard to say for sure, but likely a few months. The important thing is that he spends this time peacefully, surrounded by the people he loves." Deborah returned home determined to make Whiskers' last months the best they could be. She rearranged the house so he could easily reach all his favorite spots, prepared special meals he loved, and spent more time cuddling him. Jason, Sarah, Michael, Emily, and Mrs. Campbell also visited more often, wanting to cherish every moment. Left with the cat who had been so pivotal in uniting their families. "Whiskers," Jason said during one visit, "you're the reason I got a new family. I'll never forget that." "You were the furry matchmaker who brought our families together," Sarah added, gently stroking the cat's head. In his final months, Whiskers seemed at peace. He spent most of his time napping in Deborah's lap or playing gently with Hope, as if teaching the young cat everything he'd need to know to care for the family. A month before Whiskers passed, Deborah received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist in New York who was writing a story about animals that had changed their families' lives. "Mrs. Wilson, I learned about Whiskers' story through your book and the documentary. I'd love to include you in a special feature about heroic pets." Deborah hesitated. Whiskers was weak, and she wasn't sure it was right to put him through the stress of an interview. "Mrs. Wilson," the journalist said, sensing her hesitation, "I promise it will be very respectful. I believe Whiskers' story could inspire many people to pay closer attention to the signals their pets try to communicate." After discussing it with the family, everyone agreed it was important to document Whiskers' role in their story while he was still alive. The journalist came to Riverdale and wrote a beautiful piece about him, highlighting how he had been key in revealing Richard's secret and uniting the 2 families. The article was published in a national magazine under the title Whiskers, The Cat Who Knew How to Keep Secrets. 2 weeks after the article was published, on a quiet Sunday morning, Deborah woke to find Whiskers deeply asleep in his favorite spot, a cushion by the living room window. But when she reached down to pet him, she realized he was no longer breathing. Whiskers had passed in his sleep, peacefully and without suffering, just as Deborah had hoped for him. His passing was a deeply sorrowful moment for the entire family. Deborah organized a small ceremony in the backyard of her home where they buried the cat beneath the blackberry tree he used to climb when he was young. "Whiskers," Deborah said during the ceremony, "you fulfilled your mission in this world. You revealed the secret that needed to be revealed, united the families that needed to be united, and taught us that love can overcome any tragedy." Jason prepared a small tombstone with the inscription, "Whiskers, the cat who knew how to keep secrets and revealed the truth at the right time." Hope seemed to understand that Whiskers had passed and became even more protective of Deborah, never straying far from her for long. 3 months after Whiskers' passing, Deborah received a letter that moved her deeply. It was from a woman in Minneapolis who had read about Whiskers' story in the magazine. "Dear Mrs. Wilson, my name is Amanda and I'm 34 years old. I read the article about Whiskers in the magazine and need to share an incredible story with you. 2 years ago, my father passed away from cancer. During the wake, our cat Princess wouldn't stop meowing over the casket, just like Whiskers did with your husband. At the time, we thought it was just the cat's grief. After reading your story, we talked to our mother about Princess's behavior, and she decided to tell us a secret Dad had asked her to keep. He had a child from a previous relationship when he was very young and never had the courage to tell us. We searched for our half-brother and discovered he always knew about us and wanted to meet us, but respected Dad's decision not to say anything. Now we have a larger, closer family, and it all started because Princess tried to tell us there was something we needed to discover. Thank you for sharing your story. It changed our lives too. With affection and gratitude, Amanda Peterson." Deborah was deeply touched to see how Whiskers' story had inspired other families to pay attention to the signs their pets were trying to communicate. It was as if the cat's mission continued even after his passing. In the years that followed, Deborah received dozens of similar letters, families who discovered important secrets through their pets' behavior, people who reconciled after understanding the messages their animals were trying to convey. Deborah began including these stories in her talks, showing how animals have a special sensitivity for detecting emotional conflicts in their human families. End of story. Now, tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you think Deborah made the right decision by revealing Richard's secret? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.